So, today I want to discuss something that happened in the last few hours that I think most people are going to misread completely. Iran just declared the Strait of Hormuz completely open for commercial shipping. And within minutes, Trump posted on Truth Social in capital letters, and I want you to hear the exact words. Iran has just announced that the strait is fully open and ready for full passage. Thank you. Thank you. The President of the United States, who spent 48 days bombing Iran, who imposed a naval blockade, who threatened to destroy Iranian civilization, said thank you to Iran. Now, every major news channel is going to cover this as a victory for America. Trump forced Iran's hand. Maximum pressure worked. The blockade succeeded. Victory is close. That is the narrative you are going to hear everywhere today. I want to argue the exact opposite. What happened today is Iran demonstrating for the entire world to see that it controls the terms of this situation. Not America, Iran. And understanding why Iran has that control and why America could never have forced it otherwise requires understanding something that China built over the last decade that nobody in Washington was paying attention to. Let me walk you through this carefully, because once you understand the structure behind what just happened, you will never again believe that America is winning this war. Let me start as I always do with structure, because the structure of a situation tells you far more than any single event. And the structural question I want you to hold in your mind throughout this entire analysis is this: why could Iran open Hormuz today on its own terms? Linked to Lebanon with conditions attached, with a coordinated route it controls, with the American blockade still in place on Iranian ports, rather than on America's terms. America spent 48 days trying to force Iran to open Hormuz unconditionally. America launched the most intensive bombing campaign in the Middle East since the Gulf War. America imposed a naval blockade with over 10,000 personnel and 16 warships. America threatened to destroy Iran's power grid, its energy infrastructure, its remaining economic capacity. America said, and I want you to hear the exact words from the Pentagon podium, "You can't control anything." And yet today, Iran opened Hormuz when Iran chose to link it to Lebanon, kept a coordinated route, kept the blockade on Iranian ports in American hands, while making Iran's opening of the strait a diplomatic gesture, not a military surrender. Iran said, "Thank you for the Lebanon ceasefire, and we will open the strait in kind." America said, "Thank you," in capital letters. That is not how maximum pressure is supposed to end. That is not what "you can't control anything" produces. So, what structural force gave Iran the ability to do this on its own terms instead of America's terms? The answer is China. Not China in the news headline sense. China in the structural decade-long architectural sense. And to understand that architecture, I want to use a framework I call the survival infrastructure. Let me explain what it is and why it matters so much. The survival infrastructure is the set of systems a country builds before a crisis that allows it to absorb punishment during the crisis without collapsing. It is not military hardware. It is economic architecture. It is the financial plumbing that keeps a country alive when its enemies try to starve it. And China spent a decade building Iran's survival infrastructure, specifically because China understood long before this war started that this exact crisis was coming. Here is what that infrastructure looks like in practice. First, the oil payment system. China has been buying Iranian oil in Chinese yuan, not dollars, since the early years of American sanctions. This bypasses the SWIFT financial network entirely. SWIFT is the system that connects global banks and allows international dollar payments. American sanctions work by cutting countries off from SWIFT. If you cannot receive dollars, you cannot pay for imports. You cannot pay your military. You cannot function as a modern economy. Iran should have been cut off from global commerce years ago. It was not cut off Because China built a parallel system that does not use dollars. A system where yuan flows from Chinese refineries directly to Iranian accounts through second-tier Chinese banks that have no exposure to American financial enforcement. America designed sanctions to cut Iran off from the dollar system. China built a yuan system and handed it to Iran. Second, the dark fleet. China has been operating what analysts call the shadow fleet or dark fleet for years. These are tankers that physically disable their automatic identification systems, the GPS transponders that tell satellite tracking services where they are. They sail invisibly. They conduct ship-to-ship transfers in international waters far from port, transferring Iranian crude onto vessels with different flags and different ownership structures before those vessels sail to Chinese refineries. China's customs records show zero imports from Iran since 2022. Yet China's recorded imports of Malaysian crude in 2025 reached 1.3 million barrels per day, more than double Malaysia's entire oil production. The oil was Iranian, the paperwork said Malaysian, and China's teapot refineries, independent refineries that process sanctioned crude specifically because they are small enough to operate outside the major global financial system, absorbed every barrel without question. America built sanctions designed to cut Iran's oil revenue. China built a logistics infrastructure that made those sanctions meaningless. Third, the strategic reserve. China entered this war with approximately 1.2 billion barrels of crude oil in strategic storage built over 2 years by purchasing Iranian and Russian sanctioned oil at heavily discounted prices. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and Brent crude spiked past $120 a barrel, China did not panic. Its markets stayed stable. Its refineries kept running. Its factories kept producing. The IEA chief stood in front of cameras and said Europe had 6 weeks of jet fuel left. China had 4 months of supply cover sitting in warehouses. America calculated that closing Hormuz would create economic pain that would force Iran to negotiate. China had already neutralized that calculus by stockpiling supply before the crisis began. America's economic weapon, the energy shock, landed on everyone except the country America needed it to land on. This is the survival infrastructure. It is not a secret alliance. It is not a military pact. China never committed to defending Iran. China never promised to fight America. China simply built a decade-long economic architecture around Iran that made Iran resistant to the specific kind of pressure America was going to apply. And when America applied that pressure, 48 days of bombing, a naval blockade, financial sanctions, maximum pressure on every front, Iran survived. Not comfortably, not without damage. The central bank warned it could take 12 years to rebuild. But Iran survived well enough to choose when to open Hormuz and on what terms. And that choice, that single act of strategic agency, is what the survival infrastructure produced. Now, I want to be precise about something because I think it is important to understand exactly what China's role is and what it is not. China is not Iran's military ally. China did not fire a single shot in this conflict. China did not send soldiers or warships to defend Iran. China did not even openly defy the American blockade. When the Rich Starry, a Chinese-owned tanker, tried to pass through the strait under a Malawian flag with a spoofed transponder, it eventually turned back after American warnings. China has been careful throughout this entire war to stay below the threshold of direct military confrontation with the United States. What China is, and what it has been since long before this war, is Iran's economic insurer. The country that made sure that no matter how hard America pressed economically, Iran would retain enough oxygen to keep going. The country that bought the oil America was trying to embargo. The country that vetoed the UN Security Council resolution that would have authorized international force to open the strait. The country that called the American blockade dangerous and irresponsible in its strongest possible diplomatic language. the country that sent Wang Yi to call Arachi and tell him that China was ready to support a resolution, and that opened the door for Iran to make today's move as a gesture of diplomatic goodwill rather than a military capitulation. China did not win this war for Iran. China made it possible for Iran to survive this war long enough to end it on terms that are acceptable to Iran. That is a completely different thing, and it is a far more sophisticated and far more durable form of power than anything that comes from military force. I want to use a historical comparison here because I think it illuminates the China dimension in a way that the news coverage is completely missing. Think about Britain and the United States during the Second World War. Before America entered the war formally in December 1941, it was providing Britain with what President Roosevelt called Lend-Lease. Weapons, food, ships, raw materials, everything Britain needed to survive the German assault. America was not fighting Germany. America was not at war. But America was providing the economic and material architecture that allowed Britain to hold on long enough for the strategic situation to change. Without Lend-Lease, Britain does not survive 1941. Without surviving 1941, there is no D-Day in 1944. Without D-Day, the war ends differently. One country's quiet economic architecture changed the entire trajectory of the conflict. China is doing something structurally similar for Iran, and in some ways, more sophisticated. Britain was openly receiving American support. Everyone knew about Lend-Lease. It was public policy debated in Congress, covered by newspapers. China's support for Iran has been almost entirely invisible. The yuan payments, the Dark Fleet, the Strategic Reserve, the UN veto. None of these announced themselves as a Chinese alliance with Iran. They simply function quietly, consistently, in ways that are very difficult for America to directly confront without triggering a much larger conflict. There is a second historical comparison that I think is even more illuminating. In 1956, Britain and France launched a military operation to seize the Suez Canal after Egypt's President Nasser nationalized it. The operation was military successful. British and French forces were winning on the ground. And then the United States told Britain to stop, not through military force, through economic pressure. America threatened to refuse to support the British pound if Britain did not withdraw. Britain's currency reserves were nearly exhausted. Faced with financial collapse rather than military defeat, Britain withdrew, France withdrew, Nasser kept the canal, and the moment was remembered ever after as Britain's Suez. The moment when Britain discovered that military success means nothing if the economic architecture underneath you can be pulled away. Today's events at Hormuz are America's Suez. Not because America was defeated militarily. America has not been defeated militarily. But because America discovered that its maximum pressure toolkit, the sanctions, the blockade, the financial warfare, the military campaign, encountered a counter-architecture that China had spent a decade building. An architecture that kept Iran financially alive, kept its oil revenues flowing, kept its trade moving through invisible channels, and gave Iran the patience to choose its own moment and its own terms. Just as Britain's Suez revealed that British military power could not overcome American financial power, America's Hormuz reveals that American military power cannot overcome Chinese economic architecture. China is doing something structurally similar for Iran, and in some ways more sophisticated. Britain was openly receiving American support. Everyone knew about Lend-Lease. It was public policy. China's support for Iran has been almost entirely invisible. The UN payments, the Dark Fleet, the Strategic Reserve, the UN veto, none of these announced themselves as a Chinese alliance with Iran. They simply function quietly, consistently, in ways that are very difficult for America to directly confront without triggering a much larger conflict. And here is the crucial parallel. Just as American Lend-Lease did not mean that Britain was going to win the war, Britain needed the full entry of American military force for that. China's survival infrastructure for Iran does not mean that Iran is going to win this war in the traditional sense. Iran has suffered enormous damage. Its economy is devastated. Its military infrastructure has been degraded. It has lost its supreme leader and dozens of senior commanders. What the survival infrastructure means is that Iran has survived long enough and strong enough to sit at a negotiating table and choose when to make concessions and on what terms. That is the outcome today. Iran chose to open Hormuz. Iran linked it to Lebanon. Iran made it a gesture rather than a surrender. Iran retained the coordinated route. America posted "thank you" in capital letters. That is not what victory from 48 days of bombing looks like. That is what the survival infrastructure produces. Now let me address the question that I think is the most important analytical question coming out of today's events, because it is the question nobody in the mainstream commentary is asking. If China's survival infrastructure is what gave Iran the ability to open Hormuz on its own terms today, what does that mean for every future American attempt to use economic pressure against any country that has a deep relationship with China? I want to be very direct about this. What just happened in the Strait of Hormuz is not just an Iran story. It is a demonstration live in real time, watched by every government in the world, that the American sanctions and blockade toolkit has a structural vulnerability. That vulnerability is China. As long as China is willing to be the buyer of last resort for a sanctioned country's exports, as long as China is willing to build parallel payment infrastructure outside the dollar system, as long as China is willing to use its UN Security Council veto to block international authorization of force, and as long as China is willing to sit on 1.22 billion barrels of strategic reserves that absorb the energy shock that American economic warfare is designed to create, the toolkit does not fully work. It creates damage, but it does not create capitulation. North Korea has survived American sanctions for 3 decades. Venezuela has survived American sanctions for years. Russia has absorbed the most comprehensive sanction regime in modern history and is still fighting a major war in Ukraine. Iran has survived 48 days of bombing and a naval blockade and opened the strait on its own terms. The common thread in every case where American economic warfare did not produce the intended result is China. China's economic architecture, its alternative payment systems, its willingness to trade outside the dollar, its strategic reserves, its refusal to join American sanctions, is the structural reason that American maximum pressure produces damage but not decisive outcomes. This is not an accident. This is strategy. China has been building the architecture of American sanction resistance for decades, not as a military confrontation with the United States, but as an economic alternative to the American-dominated global financial system. And today's events in the Strait of Hormuz are the clearest single demonstration in modern history of what that architecture can produce. Let me now tell you what I think happens next. Because the Hormuz opening is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new phase. America still has its blockade on Iranian ports. The deal is not done. Iran still has enriched uranium. The nuclear question is unresolved. The ceasefire expires in 4 days. And yet Iran has already made the move that America spent 48 days trying to force it to make. Iran opened the strait. Iran linked it to Lebanon. Iran set the terms. From this position, Iran negotiates not from weakness, from the position of a country that demonstrated it could hold the world's most important energy choke point for 48 days, survive the most intensive American military campaign since the Gulf War, and still open the strait when it chose to, rather than when America demanded it to. That is an extraordinary negotiating position for a country that has been bombed for 7 weeks. What does China do in this next phase? China does what it has done throughout. It continues to call for a comprehensive ceasefire. It continues to warn against escalation. It continues to buy Iranian oil. It continues to provide the economic oxygen that gives Iran the ability to negotiate rather than surrender. And when the deal is eventually made, whatever form it takes, China will emerge with something more valuable than any military victory. China will emerge with a permanent structural position as the country the rest of the world goes to when it needs protection from American economic pressure. Spain's prime minister said it openly. There is nobody else who can resolve this situation except China. That is not a news comment. That is a structural verdict on the new architecture of global power. Let me bring this all together, because I started by saying that what happened today is being misread, and I want to be clear about what the correct reading is. America did not force Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz. Iran opened it when Iran decided to link it to a condition. Iran chose the Lebanon ceasefire on a route Iran controls, with an American blockade still in place on Iranian ports. Trump said, "Thank you." Stocks went up, oil went down, and everyone called it a victory. The correct reading is this. Iran was able to make that choice, able to choose the timing, the conditions, the framing, because China spent a decade building the economic infrastructure that kept Iran alive under the most intense American pressure it has ever faced. China's yuan payment systems, China's dark fleet logistics, China's strategic petroleum reserves, China's UN Security Council veto. These are the structural reasons that America could not simply force Iran's hand through military power alone. America brought maximum force. China had already built maximum resilience. And here is the deeper lesson. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. America deployed 16 warships and 10,000 personnel to control it. And it still had to say thank you when Iran decided to open it. That gap between America's deployed military power and its actual strategic outcome is China's work. Not through a single dramatic action, not through a declaration of war, but through a decade of quiet, patient, invisible economic architecture that America either did not see or chose not to take seriously. Every empire eventually faces the moment when it discovers that the rules of the game have changed while it was not paying attention. Rome discovered it in the Parthian Wars. Britain discovered it at Suez in 1956. America is discovering it today at the Strait of Hormuz. Iran did not defeat America. China did not defeat America. What happened is more precise and more permanent than a defeat. The architecture of American global economic power, the sanctions toolkit, the dollar system, the ability to use blockades to force political outcomes, and countered the counter-architecture that China spent a decade building, and the counter-architecture worked. Iran opened Hormuz when Iran chose to. That is the outcome, and that outcome will be studied in strategic minds and foreign ministries for decades. I want to leave you with one number. China's customs records show zero imports from Iran since 2022. Yet, China's recorded imports of Malaysian crude in 2025 reached 1.3 million barrels per day, more than double Malaysia's entire oil production. That gap between what the records say and what actually moved is not a data error. It is a system China built, a system that kept Iran alive, a system that made today possible, and a system that America, despite all its intelligence capabilities, despite all its financial surveillance tools, despite all its secondary sanction threats, could not stop. That one number, 1.3 million barrels per day of oil, that officially did not come from Iran, but obviously did, is the whole story of this war in a single statistic. Watch the next round of negotiations carefully, not for what Iran demands, for what China does not say. Because in this story, as in every great strategic shift in modern history, the most important actor is the one who says the least while building the most. This is not prophecy. This is structural history combined with game theory. Push back on this if you see it differently. Read the Asia Times analysis on China navigating the Hormuz grip. Read the Jerusalem Post on China's 1.3 billion barrel reserve. Read what Wang Yi said to Arakshi before Iran opened the strait. And then ask yourself the question that the mainstream commentary is not asking. If China built the infrastructure that made today possible, what else has China already built for the next crisis that America has not yet identified? The answer to that question is the most important strategic question of the next decade.